So recently I put together a live performance with the Push 3 SP404 Mark II and the launch control here by Novation. Since I've been working with Push for a long time, actually since before it even released, I wanted to give my thoughts about where Push is currently as a standalone device, mostly from a performance perspective, but I'll also touch on how I've been using it from a production perspective. And I'm going to do that through talking about how I built this performance here. I do encourage you to watch the whole performance if you haven't yet, just so you can get a sense of what this looks like in context and what I'm actually going to be talking about doing. First of all, everything is set up on these beautiful XTS stands by Analog Cases. They're sponsoring today's video and I want to thank them for that, but these have actually been the perfect set of stands for my setup, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them later. Push is obviously the main piece of gear in this setup. This is the standalone version, so this isn't being used as a controller. Everything you're hearing is coming from the Push, and I use it in a few different ways. One, of course, is launching clips, so I can launch this scene here, and then I also am mostly using the mixer page for the entirety of my performance. So I can bring in these different elements, bring out different elements. Really simple. I like how the mixer is displayed on Push 3. This is an important part of the introduction of my performance when I'm fading things in as part of the intro. There is also a point in the performance where I use the drum step sequencer, so when this first scene is playing, I go into note mode, arm the drums, select this hi-hat, and program in this hi-hat pattern. It's a quick, easy way to make a simple drum loop, and I could make it more complex if I wanted to, but it works perfectly in the intro of this track. I like being able to use the step sequencer on Push. It makes it unique from a lot of other controllers because I think Ableton keeps the code required to pull this off proprietary. So using a step sequencer with Push where you start entering in notes and it automatically makes a clip, that is a really cool part of using Push. I also use Push 3 to record clips, and I record vocal loops in this set. So let me go ahead and arm the vocal track now. And my vocals are coming in from the SP404 Mark II, which I'll talk about in a moment, but let me just demonstrate this. I grab the mic. Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Just like that. And we can easily just delete that clip, but there's a demo of how that works. So launching clips, doing live mixing, as well as entering in notes on the drum step sequencer, recording loops of audio for the vocal stuff. The only other thing off screen are my vocal one-shots, which I have mapped to the launch control. I will talk about that in a moment. I want to be doing as little scrolling as possible on Push. So if I can get things down to 8 tracks on screen and 8 scenes, it keeps me really organized. Of course, we can eventually scroll down. My plan is to add more songs to this set, utilize the same sort of template here, but for now, one song on one page, it works really well for me. The SP404 Mark II is off to the side here because there's not much to talk about here other than I use it for vocal processing. I think my cable's a little messed up, but if I turn this up, and I arm our vocal live track,
you can hear that I am processing my vocal through auto pitch and formant control, which makes my voice sound lower.
Push 3 doesn't currently have any vocal tuning capabilities. There's a Max for Live device called Auto Tuna, which I tried to use but won't load on my Push 3. So it's a shame that Ableton have still not developed a vocal tuning audio effect for Ableton natively, or even in this case for Push 3. I have to use an external piece of gear just to accomplish this. But I made it worth my while because while I am processing my vocal, you might have also seen me using feedback in this performance, which I do if I launch this scene here. It's just a fun way to play with feedback throughout the performance and create risers in real time with the mic. I think it sounds especially cool because I leave the vocal processing effects on while I'm getting that feedback as well. Final piece of gear here is the Novation Launch Control, a controller that I've had since my very first video on this channel. This thing is pulling its weight during this performance. It's custom mapped to controls within the session on push 3. That has to be accomplished in software on the computer, and then the project has to be sent back to push 3. I'll show you what I mean in a bit. But the launch control is doing a few different things. I am controlling filter. Here, I'll play a scene for you. Filter, high pass with some delay, low pass filter. Use this auto pan effect. This is delay on the drums only. This is bit crushing on the drums. And then beat repeat at 2 different levels. Also, I've mapped some arm buttons here on the launch control. I can arm and unarm my vocal track, and I'm also able to arm and unarm this keys track, which I didn't use in the performance, but if I want to play something in another input, I can do that. Why did I map the arm buttons here on the launch control instead of just using the arm here? Well, I have to press and hold different tracks to arm them on the push 3, and I think that is just not as instant as I want it to be. It's a subtle difference, but I want to just be able to, boom, punch that in, pick up the mic, do what I want to do. And while we have this row of buttons here, which if we just press them, simply selects the different tracks, and I don't really like the system that Ableton have created here. It's nice to be able to jump and select different tracks, especially when you're producing, right? I can see the devices for each individual track as I jump between them. But the way these functions stop, mute, and solo work, like now that I am on the bass, if I press solo, it's going to solo the bass. If I press mute, it's going to mute the track that I have selected, the bass. That's fine. I would rather just be able to change what this row of button does at any given moment. I would rather there be an arm functionality so that I could always make these arm buttons for my different tracks, rather than having to press and hold. Press and hold is fine from a production standpoint, and that's one of the big things I'm coming to realize. There are things that work really well from a production standpoint with push 3 that I love about working with it and keeps the workflow fluid. And then there are things when you start to perform with push 3, those things start to get in the way. Let's talk about a really big one of those right out of the gate here. The whole reason I have this launch control here, and I've got it custom mapped, is because I have these great master controls, right? I want to beat repeat, I want to filter, I want to do all those fun things. All those fun things are in the live session. They're on my master channel. Go to device, all those things are here. High pass filter, low, it's all there. So why didn't I just switch off of the mixer view after the performance was already done? Well, what happens is anytime you launch a clip here on push standalone, it jumps to that track. So while I'm looking at my master effects on my master right now, once I jump to bass, it switches to showing me devices for the bass, which is not helpful at all in a performance standpoint. With using push 3 as a controller, you can actually lock devices to push's screen. You can't currently do that on standalone. This is a huge issue to me, and it requires me to use a completely other piece of gear. You might say that's very useful from a production standpoint, and it's always been a function of Ableton Live that we've had an ability to turn on and off. Does launching a clip select the track? And it's something I always have turned off, so it's very frustrating that I can't turn that off here on push 3. To demonstrate how really frustrating that is, we play our intro scene here, where I'm filtering things in. Okay, I'm slowly bringing down the high pass filter. Let me enter in my percussive track. Oh no, now I'm changing the look ahead on the limiter on this percussive track. That's like super frustrating. So we're using the SP404 to do vocal processing because Ableton has yet to create proper vocal tuning and formant control for vocal processing natively in Ableton. And we're using the launch control to custom map and essentially have a locked control over specific effects because Ableton hasn't made a way for me to lock my master controls onto the screen. Clearly we've made it work, but these two extra external devices don't exist because I wanted to use them in this track. They exist because I needed to solve a problem of push 3, a limitation of push 3. And I have another frustration here with push 3 as well. As I was crafting this live set, I was moving tracks around, I was grouping different things, but suddenly I realized that some of that is impossible to do here on push 3 standalone. So if I thought, oh, I don't need my bass on this first screen, I want to move it off to another scene, it's not like I can hold down bass and move it or rearrange the tracks here on push standalone. On the other hand, I can move around the order of audio effects on a given track by holding down a button, choosing the position, and moving it. I don't see why that same principle cannot apply for tracks. I also mentioned that I had to do the custom mapping for the launch control within Ableton Live because there's no custom mapping mode that you can go into and assign MIDI mapping on the push 3 natively. I guess that's not so much of a big deal, but I did end up in a workflow where I would work on the project, I'd send it back to my computer, do the things that I couldn't do on push on the computer, and then send it back to push. I can't tell if I'm fine with that or if I hate that. Push is a unique standalone device in that if you have push, you have to own a version of Ableton Live, and the version you own of Ableton Live is what's running here on push. It's not like an MPC where you buy the MPC and everything is in the box. You could essentially work with an MPC and never interact with a computer. The push needs to work in sort of a symbiosis with your computer, in my opinion, especially since there's no arrangement mode, which technically there is. If you just press shift and record while you're doing a session, it will record an arrangement for you, but you have no means of editing that arrangement after on standalone. It will only open up again on the computer. So that seems to be Ableton's vision, is that even though it's a standalone device, it will be used as a companion with Ableton Live on the computer, which is definitely a different approach than most standalone devices. I will say most standalone devices have really bad software editors. So when I think about Ableton Live as the software editor for Ableton Push, I'm actually really grateful that it's a software editor that I fully understand how to use and is fully capable. Not this secondary piece of software that a standalone hardware maker made just to go along with their standalone piece of gear. So I have this conflicted perspective on having to constantly be in relation with my computer for a standalone device. But I guess this is specifically from a performance perspective. I've got a setup that I've talked a bunch about, my standalone setup where I'm creating ideas, recording random sounds. In fact, sounds from this session, let's say the noise from this session, this is just random sounds that I recorded while like improvising with the mic and recording my voice and recording like radio samples. That's what these sounds are, and they become an interesting part of my track. Same goes with this vocal sample. It's just some gibberish that I recorded and looped in live, and before this was ever even a live session, before there was even a backbeat, I was just recording these random sounds, my own vocals, and playing with them, toying with them. So from idea creation standpoint, from a sampling standpoint, from a just being creative standpoint, the Push 3 works really well. Where I've seen it fall apart the most is in performance. That's where you start to have to, either make some compromises and add some other gear, or you see more of a back and forth between the computer and between the standalone device. I'll show you exactly that process in Ableton Live on the software, but first I'll mention these stands once again. Thank you to Analog Cases for sponsoring today's video, but these stands are really, really awesome. They work almost like a mic stand where you can loosen them and extend them depending on the size of your gear. This is the small version, and the version that the Push is on is the large version. Using these stands like this for a single piece of gear works really well, but they also sell the trays, which allows you to put multiple pieces of gear on a single stand. It's actually great. I don't have to be hunched over a lot of my gear anymore. These two fit my Push and my SP404 perfectly, which is how I've been using them at my other desk setup. But I've also been experimenting with arranging some other gear on these stands too, and they've been very, very versatile, which is the coolest part about them. There's a link in the description where you can get 10% off your order if you decide to pick up some stands. They also sent me a pretty cool case, which you saw in my performance video as well. But check them out if you need some cool desktop stands for your gear. I think these will be perfect. Oh, and pro tip, they can help you like hide and store cables underneath these stands too. Link in the description, 10% off. Support the sponsor, support the channel. So this is the project in its starting position, essentially, for when I want to start the performance. I never really save the performance. I just record it to audio as I'm performing it, so I can constantly reload the project on push 3, and it loads in this state. You can see that the volume faders are down here on tracks 2 and 5. Those are the volumes that I bring up later in the session. None of the clips are launched, of course, and we have an empty clip slot here in the drums so that I can go ahead and record that drum sequence, which we talked about earlier. If I go into the MIDI map mode, you can see all the mappings that were mapped to the launch control on the side here. Now, I did say I couldn't do custom mappings on the push 3, but when I bring the launch control over to my computer and plug it in, I can do the custom mappings in this project, then save the project, find push in my places, and click and drag the project onto push and reopen it. That's actually why you see all these different versions: Endless Twilight 2, 3, 4, 5. These are iterations of the project that I just kept saving as I would bring it back to the computer, change some things like move around tracks, do some more custom mappings, and then save a new version. So it's not really that hard to go back and forth between push wirelessly, sending projects back and forth. But every time you want to do a new mapping, or you want to move around some tracks, you have to go back to your computer, make those adjustments, and send it back to push. I guess I didn't mention this before, but I have these vocal one-shots in this group over here. These are part of those custom mappings. And these are more set up to be like one-shot samples rather than clips that get launched. You can see that these clips are MIDI mapped here to buttons on my launch control. And they have specific launch settings, toggle and non-quantize. So that means anytime I hit those buttons on my launch control, those clips launch regardless of time in the project. And when I hit the button again, it will cut off the sample. So I can control how long the sample plays for. And I usually cut it off during the performance. I just want to also note that, of course, since this is a push standalone track, that the devices I'm using are all native to Live. So on my master channel, I have that auto pan effect, my master performance effects, and also Elephant's tape. Elephant is a producer and he creates devices for Ableton Live. His stuff has been coming in quite handy for using the push standalone because it's all built with native Ableton Live stuff. So definitely check him out. But that's Elephant Tape, which gives a little bit of a tape character over there on the master. I hope nobody gets the wrong impression. I do love using push standalone. Like I said, as an experimental sampling station, and even in crafting this performance, I really did love using this setup, but I do think there are things that Ableton should be prioritizing. And I also believe that there are things coming in Live 12 that show they are probably not going to prioritize certain things that I find important. But I understand everybody has different priorities, and my priorities might not speak to a broader audience. But there are some core fundamentals like locking things to my screen in push standalone, getting some vocal tuning audio effect built into Live. No, we don't need another distortion device. Possibly a way to custom map controllers from standalone, being able to rearrange tracks on standalone. Some of these seem like basic things, and hopefully we'll see them soon. But I hope this was a helpful walkthrough of how I'm using push to perform. Thank you to Analog Cases again for sponsoring with the XTS stand systems. Go check them out, 10% off your order with a link in the description. I'll talk to you all in the next one. Shout out to all my members. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.